Very much. I'm delighted to be with you today. As you can see, the work I'm going to present is I've been working with a colleague, Debbie Price from King's, so I'm the voice piece today, but the bits you really like are the bits I've contributed, the bits you're less sure about, no, that isn't going to work, is it? I've also put the logo up of the British Society of Gerontology, so what I'm presenting is not the view of BSG, but as President it seemed appropriate and right to flag the Society. And if any of you have got strong interest in either research or in using research, please pick up, there's some brochures about BSG on the table, so please pick them up and consider if you want to join, because we're a very friendly and open society. Right, in terms of what I want to cover today, I want to cover 4 main issues. I want to talk about the need to challenge 2 negative stereotypes or moral panics. One about the so-called baby boomers, one about the high costs of health and social care. And as the way of doing that, I want to encourage us to take more of a look around inequality and diversity through the life course, rather than just focusing upon older people and how older people may or may not be different to other generations. I want to grab hold, a bit like the Minister, Junior Minister was saying, to look at some of the opportunities and contributions made possible by an ageing population. What do we give back? What do we have to offer, rather than being defined as a deficit? But I do want to conclude by picking up, at least briefly, on some of the inevitable challenges that occurs around a kind of demographic, again, that the Junior Minister was outlining. The increased numbers of older people are going to be significant. Inevitably, that will create opportunities, but also some challenges. Let's move on to the moral panics. I'm sorry, you'll be because I haven't got the picture of what's going on in front of me. Sort of shout at me if I get out of sync with the slides, but I'll do my best to coordinate things. There's an awful lot of stuff in the media at the moment about the so-called baby boomer generation. Perhaps the most notorious book written about it is the, until recently, Minister for Universities in England, David Willetts. He wrote a book called The Pinch, How the Baby Boomers Took Their Children's Future and Why They Should Give It Back. Not a particularly positive title, I think you would have to admit around the room. Baby boomers are normally considered to have been born in the post-war rise in births, between people born between 45 and 64. So I was born in 51, so I am a baby boomer. I am one of these selfish generation that David Willetts is talking about. One of the interesting things to note is that a lot of these people are in fact not yet 60. So we talk about the baby boomers as if they are presently part of what is conventionally understood as an ageing population, whereas significant numbers of those born in the later period are in fact still in their 50s. But what they're seen as being done, people like me, as a guilty party, I've had full employment, I've made a packet from house booms and playing the owner-occupied market, I've had a final salary pension scheme, I've lived in a world that's been relatively free, certainly free of the kind of First and Second World War type conflagrations. So I've been in a privileged position. But Willetts argues that now the bills are coming in, and the people that are going to have to pick up the bills are what other authors call the jilted generation. These are really people in their late 20s, 30s, who are seen as picking up the bill, the financial problems, and hence they're sometimes called the jilted generation. They're struggling to build their careers, they won't have final pension schemes, getting on the housing ladder is difficult, etc., etc. It's a kind of setting up of the world in which it looks like inevitable intergenerational conflict is our future. And I hope the rest of my talk will argue that that's not the right way to look and understand where we are. The other stereotype is more the classic burden of an ageing population. It's seen as generating unsustainable pension costs, as well as overloading our health and social care systems. Now, these are real challenges, and I'll go on to pick up on these a little bit later. But what I think it's important to remember, that at one level this isn't new. We periodically panic about the costs of an ageing population. So if we go right back to the reforms of the late 1940s, the reforms that are often seen as creating a welfare state, the bringing in of a universal system of pensions, of free NHS care, of residential care homes to replace the old poor law, there was a lot of concern that that might not be sustainable. There was a committee set up in '54, the Phillips Committee, that was asked to look at whether what had been set up perhaps was not sustainable in the light of growing numbers of older people. And there was at the time also a huge discourse around what was called the slackening of the moral fibre of the family. There was a view that families would use these new provisions being set up by the state to abandon familial responsibilities to the older generation. So lots of anxiety and concerns. If we shoot forward to the 70s, the government at the time managed to produce a report with the delightful title of The Rising Tide, which was about increased numbers of people with dementia. So it's not unusual at one level for us to have this kind of negative views of older people, but obviously at the moment this is occurring within a particular demographic that is sharpening all of this. So our argument is that we need to look beyond these moral panics, that the focus on these panics deflects our attention away from other crucial challenges posed by an ageing population. And more specifically, that relates for the need for us to take a far greater interest in inequality amongst older people within the generations, rather than keep focusing on conflict, potential conflict between those generations. And that requires us, we would argue, Debbie and myself, is we need to look much more at people's experiences through the life course. So I'm now going to try and go on and argue why that's the case briefly in four main areas: employment, wealth, housing, and digital exclusion. Let's look at employment. I guess the first thing to note really is that already over 10% of people who are of pensionable age are in the labour market. So we don't have a world in which older people don't work and people below pensionable age do work. It's already quite a mixed picture. But beyond that, we need to realise that people's actual experience of employment is so hugely different. What we do know is that if you have extended periods of unemployment, if you experience economic hardship, if you work in low control or passive jobs, the almost inevitable consequence of that is going to be poorer health than people working in more favoured parts of the employment market. And that you will have poorer health, not only poorer health, but you will have reduced longevity. The baby boomers are not all on an even playing field as they move towards later life. Indeed, there's growing evidence of a growing gap in life expectancy at age 65 between social classes 1 and 5. So what I don't see is a great deal of focus upon those kind of growing inequalities at the moment and their implications for an ageing population. Another important and quite complex and subtle area that relates to intergenerational relations is the crucial role of grandparents, and particularly grandmothers, in providing free childcare for their adult children. This is hugely important in enabling large numbers of people to be in quite often part-time employment. Classically, the role is to support the child or to look after the child up to school age, and then once it becomes school age, it's about stepping in during the school holidays. As we know, childcare is hugely expensive. For people trying to retain a foothold in the labour market on relatively low wages, without that kind of support, there really would be almost impossible for them to stay in the labour market. So there's a kind of irony here that some older people functioning as grandparents providing free childcare, as a result of that, may not be in a position to remain in the labour market, that they may prioritise supporting 2 generations below. Let's move on to wealth and inequality. I think wealth inequalities in the UK are greater than they are around income inequality. So there are huge disparities in wealth and access to wealth within our society. Wealth has an awful lot of power that goes with it. There's not just the obvious fact that you are likely to inherit. If you are within a wealthy family, you are likely to receive and inherit a very large sums of money. But there's an ongoing ability to support children in the next generation to become owner-occupiers, financial support during internships. So lots of modern careers now require this rather strange period when you work for free in order to get into the network, to get the first foothold that enables you ultimately to become the big shot lawyer or barrister. That is an opportunity that's much more available to some people in our society than others. And even the networks needed to get your face through the door is much more available for some of us than others. And it's a bit scary to realise that the wealthiest 10% own something like 71% of the wealth of Britain. I'm not in that 10%, I would like to add. Now you could say, all right, well, we kind of know there is this rich elite. What about how the bulk of us, the bulk of the baby boomers, have basically made a packet through playing the housing market? And it does need to be acknowledged that many of us, and I would have to include myself, have gained considerable wealth through the housing market. But remember, the starting point of the David Willetts book is that I am part of a selfish generation. But if we think about it, did I pass a law that said the right thing for me to do was to be an owner-occupier? No, it was in fact previous generations. It was the governments of previous Labour and Conservative governments in the 50s, 60s and 70s that made decisions that the right way forward for our society, rightly or wrongly, was a growing emphasis upon owner-occupation as the best form of accommodation for the bulk of people. And we've seen a gradual marginalisation of housing for rent, particularly social housing for rent, linked to that. But it wasn't actually the baby boom generation that made those decisions. You could say, like everybody else, we had decisions about where we voted at general elections, but we were not really driving it. So we may have been a lucky generation, but not necessarily a selfish one. And then you've got to say, well, hang on a minute. All right, 50% of us over 50 have equity in our houses of over 150,000, and that's a significant sum of money. But 25% of pensioner households have no equity at all. They're not owner-occupiers. And then we've got to look at the fact that even within owner-occupation and across the whole of the housing market, there are huge variations in the quality of that housing. Research has come out this week that actually indicates that housing conditions in the UK are probably worsening. And we know without a shadow of a doubt that bad housing is bad for your health. And bad housing lived in by older people puts them at huge risk from respiratory disease, from hypothermia, from falls, and so on and so forth. So there are, again, huge differences in terms of people's experiences and later life on the housing line. Housing is a key fault line of inequality in the UK in terms of whether you are at the top end or the middle to top end of the owner-occupied market, or at the real bottom end of the owner-occupied market, or in renting. Because we know the rental market, without any protection now against rents going up, are just going through the roof at the moment in many parts of the UK due to an overall shortage of housing. To take a final example of the need to think things through the life course and the kind of inequalities it might be generating. Our starting point today, you remember, if I was here 10 years ago or 5 years ago, you would all have been ordered to turn off your mobile phones. Now you're effectively ordered to keep them on, so you'll tweet and tell everybody about the conference. The power and the invasion of the social media, much of it great, some of it not so great, is awesome. It's there whether you think of virtual communities like Facebook, retail, shopping online. My wife now buys most of her stuff online, clothes and the rest, comes to the door, try them on, don't like them, take them back to the shop. Consumer information. But I also think critically for this conference, more and more therapy is going to start becoming delivered through through these kinds of mechanisms. So if you have your stroke or you'll break your hip, How much time are you going to get with a physiotherapist in the future, given the overall numbers of us that may be going through those types of experience? It could well be that in the future you'll have a very short input, and then you'll have the program delivered in your, through your computer to continue your rehabilitation. For many years, the big statement was older people and computers don't mix. I think we need to throw that out really almost completely. There is a generation still who have not grown up with computers, but if you go back to the baby boom generation, they're pretty computer savvy. More and more older people are fairly confident in the use of computers. But I think there is an issue about whether access to those digital resources are going to be evenly spread across society. There are people who have more dependence than others upon accessing those kind of facilities through local libraries and the rest. Are those kind of facilities going to survive within the present financial squeeze? And are some people more able to develop a kind of digital literacy rather than others? And again, is that going to create a potential for digital exclusion if we're not careful? Right, let's go on to opportunities and contributions. So having looked at 4 areas where I think we definitely need a life course perspective around how it plays out for older people and creates potential inequality, I want to emphasise 4 areas of opportunity and contribution: informal care, civic engagement, the grey pound, and older workers in the labour force. Now at this point, some of you are going to think that I used a word search that didn't pick up the fact that acre, although a very legitimate word, is not the word I intended to use. Now I want to reassure you that at this point in the talk I thought it was important to regain your attention. So it's completely deliberate that says informal acre rather than informal care. We've already touched on the contribution of grandparents to the 2 generations below. I'm one of those people for whom the word summer holiday is a misnomer. It's a child caring opportunity that knows no bounds. Trying to pick blackberries with a 6-year-old boy who's a bit competitive with a 5- and 6-year-old girls is not fun, particularly when the 5-year-old slightly falls into the brambles and cuts themselves. I tell you, it's not. But at a very serious level, it is hugely important. My wife gave free childcare twice to children before coming up to school age. We are critically involved in supporting over school holidays, and that's the story for huge swathes of grandparents. It's a quite critical role that they are performing. If you look at it at a different level in terms of spouses, Pickard et al. Have estimated that within the next 20 years, 1.2 million older people will be cared primarily by their spouse, and that within 20 years, 1 million will be cared for by children. And of course, given the figures, the junior minister reminded us of how our lives are extending, increasingly those children will themselves be in their 60s. And any of us that are 60 knows that one of the conversations we have with people is about parents in the 4th age whose health is really beginning to decline, who are getting dementia, who are going into falls. Can they avoid a care home? Do they need to go into a care home? How do I get from London to Cambridge and back again to check mum is all okay? It's a huge pressure and responsibility upon a lot of people, and it's a huge contribution. So older people are centrally involved in responding to the health and social care challenges of an ageing population, as well as being the source of that challenge, if you like. We go on to civic engagement, a kind of posh word that academics prefer to volunteering for some reason. Governments are really, really keen on civic engagement, in volunteering, in trying to get older people to help in their communities. And the reasons for this are understandable and pretty obvious. One, we know that the actual process of volunteering is good for our health. We seem to flourish from what we gain from our volunteering experiences. And secondly, volunteers in the kind of low-key social care roles that they can perform as good neighbours, as befrienders and the rest, are taking some of the pressure off the state in terms of meeting the costs of an ageing population. I was recently involved, along with Nes Burholt, who's with us today, in a big rural ageing study, and as a part of that we surveyed 900 older rural residents from 6 communities. We found that 41% of those older people were involved at least one fairly formal voluntary or charity group, with a further 27% involved in slightly less formal groupings where they were making some kind of contribution. But it was also important to know that a significant percentages of those involved in voluntary civic engagement activity had no desire to increase that work. They felt they were at a kind of level of balance that they wanted to be in. And secondly, there was a significant group who said, no thanks, you know, we're not interested in it, we've got other things we're doing with our lives, other activities, other priorities, and we really are not seeing ourselves as potential volunteers. So it's a huge resource, but it's not an endless pool. And I think we also need to remember that governments tend to want civic engagement and volunteering to be about meeting these low-key, low-level social care needs, which are important and do really matter to people. But Martinson and Minkler pointed out now some years ago that that doesn't have to be the nature of the civic engagement, that you can also have grassroots movements led by older people that are in fact far more challenging about some of the policies and practices that are going on. And maybe what we need is a combination of both types of groups. We do need older people to hold us account, to hold the politicians to account, to make sure we're making the progress that we need to make. Right, let's go on to the grey pound, because one of the contributions we can make is the money in our pocket. If you look at the over 50s, we hold something like 80% of the private wealth, 60% of savings and 40% of the disposable income. We are quite powerful. Increasingly, private sector retailers are taking far more notice of older people than they used to as a critical market. Sociologists like Chris Gilliard and Paul Higgs have increasingly talked about how older people are defining themselves as consumers through consumerism. That there's a whole new way of being old. It's about lifestyle and how we present ourselves. And equally, governments really are capturing onto this quite significantly. It's certainly our wealth has become part of a discourse about whether universal benefits should be further squeezed. Should our general access to free or subsidised transport be taken away from us? Those kinds of areas are under threat when resources are so stretched, when it is argued that we have these resources. And almost the holy grail is, can someone come up with a clever way in which you can unlock efficiently home equity and housing and use it to meet social care needs? There's an awful lot of people knocking on ministers' doors in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland saying, I know how to do it efficiently, why don't you look at this? It could take away a lot of the social care pressures. But we need to remember that large numbers of older people do not have these advantages. 2006 to 2009, it's been shown that 26% of single pensioners and 20% of pensioner couples were on low incomes. If you define low income as less than 60% of the national median income adjusted for household size. So poverty and low income in later life has not gone away. There are lots of people who would think, if only I had wealth and savings and disposable income to play with. Some people are just getting by. And here's a quote from one of the people that were in the our rural ageing study. And what we decided the last few years was that we would do charity shopping. And so there was no great big shopping sprees, and it was just some small things for the children. And this is an elderly couple explaining their kind of Christmas shopping strategy. It's as far away from the leisure cruises and playing the slot machines in Vegas as you can get. And both worlds do exist. There's an awful lot of baby boomers. My dream is I want to do the Alaskan cruise from Vancouver up. I may or may not do that. But that is not an option available to huge swathes of older people, and we tend to forget this when we talk about the baby boomers as the lucky or the selfish generation. And finally on this, in terms of contributions, let's briefly turn to older people in the labour market. The formal position now of the Department of Works and Pensions is what's called fuller lives. That seems to be the new preferred term, is we're going to have fuller working lives. That, I think, is great. It does mean that more and more older people will want to be able to stay in paid employment longer. There are companies like Centrica and BMW that are getting quite a lot of profiling, good publicity for the way in which flexible working is being developed with workforce, particularly when they're seen as a skilled resource. I think one thing we should have confidence in knocking on the head in terms of intergenerational conflict is that the labour market isn't some kind of lump. You know, these are the number of jobs, so if older people are doing this percentage, there's that less percentage available for younger adults. It's partly that older people want to do rather different jobs, but it's also that our involvement in the labour market in turn it generates resource and economic growth, which in turn generates jobs that younger adults may do. But this isn't the dream world for everybody. We've got to remember that there is another group of older workers who may be desperate to get out of the labour market, who may be doing those low control jobs, who may be doing jobs that require a level of physical grind that starts to get impossible as you hit into your mid to late 60s. And yet without some of the supports that used to be there in the past, in terms of when pensions kicked in, what is their position going to be like? How are they not going to end up struggling to carry on? There's a new Centre for Ageing Better being established in the UK, funded with big lottery fund money. And it looks like one of their first priorities will be to work with major employers around flexible working and building flexible working in. And as president, I had a chance to meet Lord Filkin, Jeff Filkin, who's the chair of trustees. And Jeff was talking about how he felt at the moment companies lacked imagination and how this new world could be brought to bear. And the challenge I posed to him was the construction industry, because I have personal experience of stepchildren, adult stepchildren working within the construction industry. And it's hard to see how that kind of supportive environment might develop within the harsh realities of being a ground worker on a construction site. Right, let's end with 4 challenges. The first of these is health and social care I'll touch on. Then I'll go on to have a very brief look at pensions, then social participation, and then back to the issue of equity. More in terms of equity, as I said, within the generations rather than between the generations. One thing I'd meant to say at the very start, and I'll say now a bit belatedly, is that when Debbie and I were talking about this talk, we had the we're doing it in Northern Ireland conversation. And what we decided, rightly or wrongly, and I think rightly, was not to try and turn ourselves into bad Northern Ireland experts. That we would present it from a UK perspective, occasionally, of course, drifting into a slightly English-centric version of the UK, and I'm sure on occasions, because of that, I will have managed to slightly annoy some of you. But it seemed better than trying to pretend we could get our head around some of your governance traditions and differences, and not to do it very well. Of course, one of the areas where this starts to get really tricky is around health and social care, because you've always delivered health and social care in a rather different way. We had in any case, I think how you fund health and social care, and particularly social care, could be a day conference in itself. It's a highly complicated area. So I think what we can say is that there are going to be huge pressures upon health and social care budgets in the future. The Care Act is going through, that's going to put a cap on 72,000 in terms of the social care costs you should be expected to meet. What I'm still not completely clear about is how the Care Act is or isn't going to affect Northern Ireland. So if anybody wants to find me at lunch and take me through that, exactly where you stand with regard to that, I'd be very interested to have that conversation with you. But I think we can say, we know the direction of pressure is that we should be expected to fund more and more of what we receive in terms, certainly of social care and to some extent health. And that's overlain by the fact that there are more and more health and social care products in the marketplace that some of us can afford and others of us will not be able to afford. Now, I nearly put the word teeth implants in my overhead, and I felt I didn't feel quite right, so I took it out. But I seem now to be besieged by middle-class professionals in their 60s, consumed about whether they're going to have teeth implants. It's about 2,000 quid a throw, so if you've got 5 teeth need replacing, you've just got a stack of £10,000 and set light to it and made a dental surgeon quite rich. That's very nice. That means Robin can have a full set of teeth well into his 80s. It's not an option for large numbers of people. It's only one specific example, but wherever we look, we have products on the market, on the fringes of health and social care and lifestyle and cosmetic looks, that is available to some of us and not others of us. And I think, again, that will become a fault line of inequality if we're not careful. So I think it's going to be hard. It's going to be very interesting in terms of Scotland, in terms of their commitment to free social care. Can they continue to afford it? And does it become at the cost that what they can provide becomes very, very limited? So to know that you can have free social care, but actually like only 10 people can get it, that isn't in that sense. It means a lot of people are being told they're not in priority need. If they were in priority need, they could have it. But more and more people are not being in priority need. And the really scary information is the literal number of people in receipt of social care is going down at the moment. Those receiving it might be getting pretty intensive packages. But you've got to be more and more disabled and frail to stand a chance of getting a significant social care package. And I think that is worrying and led Debbie and I to kind of wonder how sustainable is this going to be? Can we not be radical and think of some quite dramatic and different policies that would look at this very differently? But I also want to say and really stress that whatever system we've got, the delivery of undignified care by health and social care professionals is unforgivable, and you cannot hide behind the financial pressures and dilemmas as an explanation of this. The Francis inquiry into the Mid Staffordshire Hospital Trust presented an appalling picture of neglect of patients, and the most neglected patients, of course, were the older patients, in terms sometimes almost verging on physical abuse, of lack of support around eating, of people becoming dehydrated. And that picture in small scales will appear on your regional television screens all over the UK, where X-care home, has been pointed, one of the care staff has been sacked or just got a 6-month sentence or whatever. We really have to confront and try and stop this by working with the quality control systems. But we also need to acknowledge that it's not just about the extreme ends of abuse. Liz Lloyd and her colleagues from the University of Bristol, under the New Dynamics of Aging, did a fascinating study talking to people right at the end of their lives in the 4th age. What do you want from your health and social care professional? And Liz and colleagues argued that all of us, when we get to that point, when it gets to that 87, 88 years old, multiple chronic conditions beginning to undermine our quality of life, our robustness, it makes it so difficult to retain our sense of dignity and identity. And therefore, health and social care professionals need to be trained. We must work with them to get as good as they possibly humanly can be in supporting that dignity and sense of identity in terms of how they talk and how they engage with their elderly clients. And I really hope that's one thing, that's a very practical thing we can all do, because I'm very aware that some of what I say can seem, it's quite hard to change. These are embedded inequalities that are growing within our society, but how we actually treat people on the ground is within our domain, and we really need to make sure we pick up that challenge. Very briefly on pensions, in some ways reiterating a point, many people standing here would talk about the huge pressures that are going to come on the state pension system. They would talk about why it may be necessary to push the state pension age even further back. There are clearly some concerns about the viability of some pension schemes in terms of rising numbers and rising demands. So I am part of a lucky generation. I got my final pension scheme from the university system. New entrants into academia are being offered far less generous terms. One source of conflict with my eldest daughter is the fact that her civil service pension scheme doesn't look half as decent as it kind of used to. But having said that, I think those that earn well, those that inherit a bit, those that have a reasonably good pension scheme are going to be broadly okay. But what about those on low or minimum wages, probably in poor health, having to wait now, later and later even to get a state pension? What does it mean when we talk about the wonderful opportunities of later life for that group of people, unless we can find ways to intervene to challenge that? Okay, so I'm painting a scenario in which older people enter later life with very different resources, very different social capital at their disposal, very different levels of health robustness. We know, irrespective of that social engagement, active aging, as the junior minister called it, it's often called it, is a good thing. That will maximise our chances of gaining as much as we can from our particular situation. But that, surely it's true that unless local authorities, unless the third sector, the voluntary sector, can work with our more deprived neighbourhoods to bring in the resources, to create leisure opportunities, to help make things happen for people, again we're going to create a divide. That those opportunities for social engagement are going to be very unevenly spread throughout our society. And I really worry that as the financial squeeze begins to hit harder and harder, it's the more preventative activity that's the easiest to close down. And then the consequence of that potentially is less opportunities for an active lifestyle for those with least resources and have entered later life with the poorer health, which means they will then spin into a health and social care crisis earlier than they needed to if we were able, because we have failed to create those opportunities. Right, I'm now on my last two slides. I've hinted at my family a couple of times. I'm a kind of reblended family, a reblended couple, 6 adult children. My general advice to you is don't fall for someone with 4 adult sons. It can be very, very dangerous. Of our 6 kids, 2 are owner-occupiers. 1 is in the hot house of London. Just sold a 2-bed Victorian property in Greenwich, terraced house, for £425,000 in a week. 1 Saturday viewing, 4 offers, full price, deal done. Extraordinary, unbelievable, 2-bed Victorian terrace. But I only have other of our children are only occupied. 4 of our adult children rent at the moment. Only 1 has access to a high quality works pension, again as you would expect, the person in London who's playing the housing market. None of the others are presently saving for their post-retirement. 2 are in jobs that offer no formal holiday pay, the wonders of the construction industry. So your £13 an hour assumes you are saving money for your fortnight's Christmas break that happens in the construction industry and your other holidays. No sickness pay scheme run by those firms beyond their wildest kind of dreams, really, that such a thing might exist within that end of the construction industry. A lot of the 11 grandchildren, step-grandchildren, rather a lot, an awful lot of free childcare going on to try and support those adult children, to kind of make it. And to some extent, the fact that myself and my wife, we are baby boomers who have owned property, there is a kind of there's a likelihood of inheritance that will probably protect them from the worst end of poverty that they could find themselves in. But if their own parents didn't have those resources, particularly those working in the construction industry, without pensions, without holiday pay, with partners struggling to be in a labour market, are in an incredibly vulnerable position and are potentially not a great inheritance for future cohorts. So what have I been trying to say? The big challenge posed by an ageing population is not inequity between the generations, but rather inequity within the generations. I've argued to you today that not only do such inequities escalate over the life course, but present social and economic policies are likely to exacerbate this trend. The huge question is whether or not there are alternatives to present policies which would place a higher emphasis upon maintaining a society of more equality of opportunity throughout the life course. Thank you.